Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that twist the mundane into the macabre, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more boring bedtime stories. Tonight's chapter is a slow descent into the peculiar, the kind of story that makes you question the wisdom of accepting gifts from long-lost relatives. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Inheritance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which should have been the first warning. Tuesdays, in your experience, were the days when bad news decided to stretch its legs and saunter into your life with all the subtlety of a drunken uncle at a funeral. The envelope was thick, the kind of paper that felt expensive under your fingers, and the wax seal bore a crest you didn't recognize. A windmill with what appeared to be a face, its wooden blades twisted into something resembling a grimace. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, the ink so dark it seemed to bleed into the fibers. It informed you, in the stiff language of legal documents, that one Algernon P. Windgrave, your great-great-great-uncle twice removed, or some other convoluted relation you'd never heard of, had left you his windmill. Not a fortune, not a quaint cottage by the sea, but a windmill. The location was listed as the outskirts of hitherto one Smudge, a village so small it didn't appear on any map you could find. The lawyer's office was in a part of the city where the buildings leaned against each other like gossiping old women, their brickwork stained with centuries of secrets. Mr. Thistlewick, the solicitor, was a man who looked as if he'd been carved from a block of yellowing ivory, his fingers steepled under his chin as he regarded you with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah," he said, sliding the deed across the desk. "The windmill of the hollow breeze. A fine inheritance, if I may say so." You hesitated. "Is there a catch?" Thistlewick's smirk deepened, revealing teeth that were just a shade too sharp. "Oh, no catch. Though I suppose you could say it comes with character." He leaned forward, the lamplight casting shadows that made his face look like a poorly assembled puzzle. Algernon was a peculiar man. Built the windmill himself, back in 1783. Or was it 1683? Time does get so fuzzy around certain places. The deed was cold in your hands, the paper unnaturally smooth. The windmill's official name was listed as the Mill of Everlasting Sighs, which sounded less like a property and more like a bad omen. Thistlewick's smile never wavered as he added, "You'll find the keys under the mat, or perhaps in the mouth of the gargoyle." Algernon had a sense of humor. The journey to hitherto on Smudge was a study in vanishing landmarks. The roads narrowed from asphalt to gravel to dirt, then to something that might have been a goat path in a previous life. The village, when you finally found it, consisted of 6 houses, a pub called the Drowned Rat, and a post office that appeared to have been abandoned mid-transaction, a single letter still half-poked into the mailbox. And then there was the windmill. It stood on a hill, its silhouette jagged against the twilight sky. The sails were motionless, though the wind was strong enough to send your coat flapping like a panicked bird. The structure itself was wrong. Not crumbling, not neglected, but somehow off, as if it had been built with angles that didn't quite obey the laws of physics. The door was carved with symbols that looked like a cross between mathematical equations and the scribbles of a delirious monk. The key, as promised, was indeed in the mouth of a gargoyle, a leering stone face beside the door, its tongue lolling out in a way that suggested it had just told a joke, only it understood. The lock turned with a sound like a dying man's sigh, and the door swung open on its own. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old flour and something else, something metallic. The walls were lined with shelves of jars, each containing what appeared to be teeth. Human teeth, animal teeth, teeth that didn't belong to any creature you could name. A ledger lay open on a table, its entries written in a spidery hand. June 12th. Ground 3 molars, 1 incisor, wind refused to turn. June 3rd out in a premolar. Wind agreeable. You were halfway up the stairs to the grinding mechanism when you heard it. a low, rhythmic creaking like the sound of a ship's mast bending in a storm. But there was no wind. The sails outside were still. And then the whispering started. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like the echoes of words, as if the windmill had absorbed every conversation ever held inside it, and was now playing them back in fragments. A child's laughter here, a muttered curse there, and beneath it all, a voice that might have been Algernon's, humming a tune that made your teeth ache. By the time you reached the top, the grinding stones were moving, though there was no grain in the hopper. They turned slowly, methodically, and between them you could just make out something pale and glistening being pulverized into powder. That was when you noticed the note nailed to the beam above your head. It read in the same handwriting as the ledger, "Congratulations on your inheritance. Do try to keep the wind happy. It gets irritable when neglected." Outside, the first of the sails began to turn. Chapter 2. The first ominous sign. The windmill's sails continued their slow, impossible rotation, groaning like a beast shifting in its sleep. You stood frozen at the top of the stairs, watching the grinding stones turn with no grain to justify their labor. The air hummed with an energy that made your skin prickle, as if the very dust motes were charged with something unnatural. You backed down the steps, eyes never leaving the grinding mechanism. The whispering voices grew louder, though still indistinct, murmurs and half-formed words that slithered through the gaps in the floorboards. By the time you reached the bottom, the door swung shut behind you with a quiet finality, as though the windmill had politely but firmly decided it was time for you to leave. Outside, the night was eerily still. No breeze stirred the grass, no owl called from the trees. Yet the sails kept moving, their wooden blades slicing through the air with a rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh that set your nerves on edge. You glanced back at the gargoyle, its stone face now twisted into what could only be described as amusement. The village of hitherto unsmudged was no more welcoming by daylight. The few villagers you encountered moved with the hurried gait of people, pretending not to see you. The baker, a gaunt man with flour dusted across his apron like a second skin, flinched when you asked if he'd known Algernon. "Never met the fellow," he muttered, shoving a loaf of bread into your hands with a haste that suggested he was paying you to leave. "Best keep to yourself, if you've got sense." The pub, the Drowned Rat, was the only place that seemed remotely hospitable, though hospitable was a generous term. The innkeeper, a woman with a face like a well-worn saddle, poured you a mug of something that smelled like fermented regret and said, without looking up, "You're the one who got the mill, then?" You nodded. "Seems that way. Any idea why my great-great-great-uncle left it to me?" She snorted. "Not a clue. But if I were you, I'd sell it fast, or burn it, or leave the country." The other patrons, all three of them, stared into their drinks with the intensity of men trying to forget something terrible. One of them, a grizzled old farmer with a patch over one eye, finally spoke. "That mill's been there longer than the village. Some say it was there before the land was even named. Algernon didn't build it. He just woke it up." A silence settled over the room, thick enough to choke on. The innkeeper wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better centuries. "Ask the widow Pembroke," she said at last. "If anyone knows the stories, it's her. Lives in the crooked house by the church. Not that she'll tell you much, but she's got the eyes for it." The crooked house was indeed crooked. It leaned so severely to one side that you half expected it to topple over if you knocked too hard. The widow Pembroke answered before you even raised your hand to the door, as if she'd been waiting for you. She was a small woman, wrapped in shawls that might have once been colorful but had long since faded to the hue of old tea stains. Her eyes, however, were sharp, pale and clear, like chips of ice. "You've met the mill," she said. It wasn't a question. You nodded. "It's unusual." She chuckled, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Unusual. That's one word for it. Come in, then. But don't touch anything, and don't ask about the teeth." Inside, the house was a labyrinth of curiosities, Jars of pickled things that might have been vegetables, or might have been something else, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and a grandfather clock that ticked irregularly, as if it couldn't quite decide what time it was. The widow settled into a rocking chair and gestured for you to sit on a stool that looked like it had been carved from a single gnarled root. Algernon was a fool, she said bluntly. Thought he could bargain with the mill. Thought he could make it work for him. And for a while it did. Flour, finer than anything you've ever tasted. Ground so smooth it was like silk. But mills like that, they don't run on wheat. They run on something else. You thought of the ledger, the entries about teeth. What do they run on? The widow's smile was thin and knowing. Depends on the mill. Yours is hungry. Always has been. Algernon fed it what he could. But in the end, it wanted more than he was willing to give. So he left. Or tried to. You don't really leave a place like that. A gust of wind rattled the windows, though the air outside had been still moments before. The widow's gaze flicked toward the sound, and for the first time you saw a flicker of unease in her expression. You hear it, don't you? She murmured. The wind's picking up. It knows you're here. It's been waiting. Back at the windmill, the sails were spinning faster now, their creaks turning into a low, insistent whine. The door stood ajar, as if inviting you back inside. From the darkness within, something scraped against the floor, a sound like bone on wood. You took a step back, then another. The windmill, for all its eerie sentience, did not follow. But the feeling of being watched did not fade, not even when you reached the edge of the village and looked back one last time. The sails had stopped, and the gargoyle was smiling. Chapter 3. The Previous Owner's Diary. Sleep did not come easily that night. The inn's bed was little more than a sack of straw masquerading as comfort, and every time you closed your eyes, the windmill's creaking echoed in your skull. When dawn finally seeped through the grimy window, you dressed with the grim determination of an archaeologist preparing to open a cursed tomb. The windmill had answers, even if you weren't entirely sure you wanted them. The walk back to the mill was unnervingly quiet. No birds sang, no insects hummed, just the crunch of your boots on the overgrown path. The gargoyle's grin had widened since your last visit, its stone lips now curled into something disturbingly gleeful. The windmill door, which you had distinctly remembered closing behind you, stood slightly ajar again. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old, dry rot, like pages left to molder in a sealed attic. The jars of teeth gleamed dully in the morning light, their contents somehow more unsettling in the clarity of day. But it wasn't the teeth that caught your attention this time. It was the desk, tucked into the far corner, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten tapestry. The desk's single drawer resisted at first, then gave way with a screech that sent a flurry of dust motes swirling. Inside, nestled between a rusted penknife and a desiccated mouse skeleton, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age, the spine held together by fraying threads. The name Algernon P. Wingrave was embossed on the front in peeling gold leaf. You hesitated. Reading a dead man's diary felt like an intrusion, but then again, you'd already inherited his nightmare mill. Propriety seemed a trivial concern. The first few pages were mundane, notes on grain prices, complaints about the weather, a recipe for something called moon-baked rye that called for 3 pinches of graveyard soil, harvested under a waning crescent. But as you flipped further, the entries grew erratic. June 17th. The stones whisper again. Louder this time. They say they're hungry. I have given them the last of the molars from the old churchyard, but they want more. I told them they'll have to wait. June 23rd. Found another tooth in my porridge this morning. Not mine. At least I don't think so. The mill insists it's part of the bargain. I don't remember agreeing to this. July 1st. The shadow is back. It stands at the foot of the stairs when I grind at night. I told it to leave, and it laughed. I didn't know shadows could laugh. The handwriting deteriorated as the entries went on, the letters slanting and trembling as though written in a hurry or in fear. July 14th, it followed me to town today. No one else saw it, but I could feel it breathing down my neck. Widow Pembroke gave me a charm and told me to sleep with it under my pillow. It burned my fingers when I touched it. I think that means it's working. July 30th, the mill is singing. It's not a song I recognize. It's not a song meant for human ears. I've locked the grinding mechanism, but the stones keep turning anyway. They say they'll stop if I give them something precious. I don't know what they mean. I don't have anything precious left. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared as though splashed in haste. August 12th. It has my name now. I can hear it in the wind. It's calling me. I won't go. I won't, but the shadow is at the door. It's smiling. I think... Cool. The rest of the page was torn away, leaving only a jagged edge. You lowered the journal, your throat dry. The silence in the mill was oppressive, the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of grinding, slow, deliberate, though the mechanism remained still. From the corner of your eye, something shifted near the stairs. A patch of darkness that didn't belong, a shape that flickered when you tried to focus on it. The journal slipped from your fingers and hit the floor with a thud. The grinding stopped. And then, from somewhere deep within the mill's wooden bones, a voice that wasn't quite a voice murmured, "Hungry." You didn't run. Running would mean admitting it was real. Instead, you walked calmly, steadily, back to the door, your spine prickling with the certainty that something was watching. The gargoyle's grin had vanished. Its stone face was now frozen in an expression of startled recognition, as if it had just seen something it hadn't expected. You didn't look back as you left, but you could feel it, the mill's gaze, heavy and patient, settling on your shoulders like a shroud. It had your name now, too. Chapter 4. The Cursed Grindstone. You should have left hitherto on smudge after finding Algernon's diary. Packed your things, boarded the first coach out, and never looked back. But something kept you there. A stubbornness, perhaps, or the quiet, gnawing certainty that the mill wouldn't let you go that easily. So you returned, this time with a lantern, a bottle of something strong enough to make bad decisions seem reasonable, and the grim resolve of a man poking a sleeping bear with a stick just to see what would happen. Night fell like a hammer. The windmill loomed against the bruised sky, its sails motionless but watchful, as though holding its breath. You stepped inside, the floorboards groaning underfoot like a chorus of disapproving ghosts. The air smelled different tonight, thicker, sharper, with an undercurrent of something acrid that made the back of your teeth ache. Midnight came without fanfare. No church bells rang in hitherto on smudge. No clocks struck the hour. You only knew it by the sudden, marrow-deep chill that seeped into the mill, frosting the edges of your lantern light. And then the grinding started. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic creak of earlier. This was a wet, crunching sound, like bones being pulverized between stones. The mechanism turned on its own, the great millstones groaning as they rotated, their surfaces dark and glistening under the flickering lantern. You edged closer, though every instinct screamed to run. The hopper was empty, no grain, no teeth, nothing to justify the labor of the stones. And yet, from between them, a fine black powder began to spill. It gathered in the trough below, piling up in drifts like cursed snow. The smell hit you then, burnt hair, yes, but something else beneath it, something sweet and rotting, like fruit left too long in the sun. A draft stirred the powder, sending up a small, twisting cloud. For a moment, the particles hung in the air, forming shapes, a face, a hand, a mouth stretched wide in a scream, before dissolving back into nothing. You reached out, curiosity outweighing sense, and let a pinch of the dust fall onto your palm. It was warm. unnaturally so, as if it had been baked in an oven no human had ever lit. The moment it touched your skin, a jolt ran up your arm, a sensation like static electricity mixed with the fleeting, panicked thought that you were not alone in your own head. The grinding stopped. Silence rushed in, thick and sudden. The lantern's flame guttered, though no wind had blown through the mill. And then, from the darkness at the top of the stairs, came a sound, a whisper, too soft to make out words. Human. You weren't foolish enough to answer, but you weren't foolish enough to stay either. The walk back to the village was a blur. The black dust still clung to your fingers, refusing to be brushed away. By the time you reached the drowned rat, your hand was tingling, the sensation spreading up your wrist like creeping frost. The innkeeper took one look at you and slid a mug of something strong across the counter without a word. You drank it in one go, barely registering the burn. "Touch the grindings, did you?" she said, her voice oddly gentle. You nodded, flexing your fingers. The tingling had dulled, but it wasn't gone. She sighed. "Well, that's that then." "That's what?" But she only shook her head and refilled your mug. "Best drink up. You want to be good and numb for what comes next." Back at the mill, unseen in the dark, the grindstones began to turn again. And in the village, the first of the rats started to die. Chapter 5. The village's dark secret. The rats died quietly, their little bodies curled up in doorways and alleys as if they had simply fallen asleep. By morning, the village children were collecting them with morbid fascination, lining them up like tiny furry firewood along the edges of the well. No one mentioned the black dust clinging to their whiskers. You spent the day trying to scrub the residue from your hands, but the powder had bonded to your skin like ash after a fire. The tingling had spread to your elbow now, a persistent buzz like the hum of a distant beehive. You needed answers, and there was only one place left to look. The drowned rat was unusually crowded for a weekday. Word of the rat deaths had spread, and the villagers huddled over their drinks with the tense posture of men waiting for the other boot to drop. In the corner, slumped over a table like a sack of damp flour, was a man you hadn't seen before. Tall, gaunt, with a nose like a hatchet and fingers stained ink black. The innkeeper caught your gaze and jerked her chin toward him. "That's Elias Candlewick, town historian, if you can call scribbling in moldy books a profession. Knows more about this place than anyone, including things no sane person wants to remember. Buy him a drink and he might talk. Buy him 3, and he'll tell you things that'll rot your teeth." You slid onto the bench across from Candlewick. He blinked up at you with eyes that were startlingly clear for a man who smelled like a distillery's back room. "You're the mill inheritor," he said, his voice hoarse but precise. "I wondered when you'd come knocking." You pushed a tankard toward him. "Tell me about the windmill." Candlewick took a long, slow sip, then set the drink down with exaggerated care. "Not a windmill, not really. Oh, it grinds, and it's got sails, but that's just the skin it wears. The thing underneath, well, that's older." He leaned in, the alcohol on his breath thick enough to pickle a cucumber. 800 years ago, give or take a decade, this wasn't a village. It was a meeting place for the old folk, the ones who worship things with too many teeth. It had a justice system. Take them up the hill to the standing stones and grind them. Literally. Had a great flat rock with a hawk. You stared at him. "You're saying the windmill is built on top of a pagan torture site?" Candlewick smirked. "Not just built on it, built from it. Those grindstones in your mill, they're the same ones, the original ones, the ones that still remember the taste of bone." He took another drink, his Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing float. "When the Christians came, they tried to sanctify the place, built a chapel. It burned down, built another. That one collapsed. After the third attempt, someone had the bright idea to repurpose the stones into something useful. Hence, the mill. And for a while, your hand twitched, the black dust glinting dully under the tavern lights. What kind of things? Blood at first, then teeth, then names. Candlewick's gaze dropped to your stained fingers. Looks like it's got a taste for you now. A silence settled over the table. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with a sound like impatient fingers. Algernon thought he could outsmart it, Candlewick muttered, almost to himself. Made bargains, left offerings, kept it fed just enough to stay quiet. But the mill's patient. It'll wait centuries for what it wants. He fixed you with a look that was suddenly, uncomfortably sober. You ever wonder why a man you'd never even heard of left you his property? The question hung in the air like a noose. Back at the Windmill, the sails began to turn, though the night was dead calm. Inside, the grindstone stirred, flecks of black dust still clinging to their surfaces. And deep in the mill's wooden bones, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened an eye. Candlewick's final words followed you out into the dark. It's not the mill that's cursed, it's the bloodline. And you, my friend, are the last bag of flour on the shelf. The gargoyle watched you approach, its stone face now twisted into something between a grin and a grimace. The door swung open before you could touch it. Inside, the air hummed with anticipation. The ledger lay open on the table, a fresh entry scrawled in handwriting that wasn't yours. Tonight's grinding. One inheritance, lightly used. From the shadows at the top of the stairs, something chuckled. You were out of drinks, out of historians, and nearly out of time. But one question burned hotter than the rest. What had the mill ground last night? And why did the black dust in your pocket feel like it was getting heavier? Chapter 6. The Nightly Visitors. The black dust had begun whispering. Not in words exactly, more in sensations like the memory of speech. You'd sewn it into a small pouch to keep it from spilling, but even through the fabric, it pulsed against your thigh like a second heartbeat. Tinkling in your arm had spread to your shoulder now, a constant, crawling itch beneath the skin. You didn't want to return to the mill? Every instinct screamed to flee, to burn the pouch and never look back. But something deeper, older, pulled you forward. The same primal urge that makes children peek at monsters under the bed. Midnight found you seated at Algernon's desk, a single candle flickering in the draught. The ledger lay open before you, its pages filled with that same spidery script, documenting centuries of grim transactions. Sommer, 1542. 12 teeth, incisors mostly unwilling. Harvest moon, 1698. 3 fingers left hand own, grinding smooth. Callhallows Eve, 1789. One firstborn's name. Mill content. You turned a page and the candle guttered violently. The temperature dropped so suddenly your breath fogged the air. Outside, the windmill's sails groaned into motion, though no wind stirred the night. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps at the door, each one vibrating through the floorboards like a mallet, striking a coffin lid. The gargoyle's face had changed again, its mouth now stretched wide in a silent scream. You stood, legs trembling, and approached the door. The knocking came again, harder this time, accompanied by a sound like dry reeds rustling. You opened the door. They stood in a semicircle at the base of the steps, 5 figures in tattered garments that might have been fashionable 3 centuries ago. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their hands were clearly visible, skeletal fingers clutching empty sacks, the fabric straining as if hungry. The tallest figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of a cold draft through a graveyard gate. "Tribute," it rasped. Your throat tightened. "I don't—" "Tribute," the figure repeated, more insistent. Behind it, the others swayed forward in unison, their empty sacks twitching. The pouch at your hip grew heavier, the black dust humming against your leg. You reached for it instinctively, and the figures stilled, their hidden gazes locking onto the movement. The leader extended its sack. Eindings creaked. Understanding dawned like a sickness. They wanted the dust, the cursed powder from the stones. You hesitated, fingers brushing the pouch. Giving it felt like a mistake. Keeping it felt like a death sentence. The figure's patience wore thin. Its voice dropped to a whisper that slithered into your ears like smoke. No tribute, no peace. The mill hungers. The mill remembers. From deep within the building, the grindstones rumbled to life, their vibrations traveling up through the floorboards. The figures didn't react, but their postures stiffened, their empty sacks trembling with anticipation. You untied the pouch. The moment it left your hands, the lead figure snatched it with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, pouring the black dust into its sack with reverent care. The others crowded close, their breath, though they shouldn't have needed breath, coming in ragged, eager gasps. The dust pulsed once in the sack, a dark, liquid ripple, and the figures shuddered in unison. For the briefest instant, their shadows stretched long and jagged against the mill's walls, forming shapes too angular, too many-jointed to be human. Then, as suddenly as they'd come, they were gone. Only the imprint of their feet remained in the frost that had gathered on the steps. Inside, the grindstones fell silent. The ledger's pages fluttered, revealing a fresh line of text that hadn't been there before. Tonight's grinding. One measure of fear. One whisper of compliance. Interest paid. Principal remains. The candle snuffed itself out. You stood in the dark, the mill's silence pressing in like a held breath. The visitors were satisfied for now, but the ledger's words echoed in your skull. Principal remains. Somewhere above, in the mill's hidden crevices, something sharpened its teeth. Morning would come eventually. But the debt wouldn't wait that long. Chapter 7. The Bargain. 3 nights passed without visitors. The mill stood silent, its sails still, its grindstones dormant. The black dust was gone from your fingers, though the tingling remained, a constant, gnawing reminder that whatever had entered your bloodstream wasn't done with you yet. You should have taken the silence as a blessing. Instead, it settled over hitherto unsmudged like a held breath, the villagers eyeing you with a mix of pity and wary relief whenever you passed. Even the rats had stopped dying, their tiny corpses cleared away with funereal solemnity by the children. On the 4th night, the dreams began. You stood in the mill, but not as it was now. This was an older version, its walls rough-hewn timber, its grindstones dark with something that wasn't flour. A figure hunched over the mechanism, its back to you, arms working in slow, deliberate strokes as it fed handfuls of glistening red chunks into the hopper. "You're late," the figure said without turning. Its voice was the creak of rope under tension. You tried to speak, but your throat wouldn't obey. The figure straightened, revealing a man who might have been Algernon Wingrave, if Algernon had been left out in the elements for a century. His skin was parchment, stretched over bone, his eyes milky orbs that somehow still saw you. He wiped his hands on an apron that had once been white, leaving rust-colored streaks. "They'll be back," he said. "The guests, hungrier next time. They always are." The dream shifted. Now you stood at the grinding stones, your own hands feeding them something soft and pulsing. The mechanism turned without sound, the stones pressing closer together with each rotation, until they nearly touched. You woke in a cold sweat, the taste of copper on your tongue. The mill door stood open. You hadn't left it that way. Inside, the air hummed with the same charged silence that precedes a lightning strike. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages blank except for a single line that dripped fresh ink. Terms to be discussed. The grindstones began to turn. Not the slow, sleepy rotation of before. This was purposeful, deliberate, each revolution accompanied by a wet, crunching sound that made your teeth ache. A figure materialized between the stones. Not the tattered visitors from before, nor the dream Algernon. This one wore the sturdy wool and leather of a miller from another age, his face obscured by a flour sack tied roughly over his head. 2 eye holes had been cut into the fabric, but only darkness stared out. When he spoke, his voice was the sound of grain slipping through fingers. "Keeper or kept," he said. "That's the choice before you." You swallowed hard. "I don't understand." The sack-headed figure tilted its head. "Simple math, really. The mill needs a miller. Always has. You can take up the post properly, feed it what it asks for, keep the guests satisfied, or you can become part of the process." He gestured to the grindstones, which had begun to ooze a thick, dark liquid. Algernon tried the latter. Didn't suit him. The implications settled over you like a shroud. "How long?" "As long as it takes," the figure said pleasantly. "Could be years. Could be centuries. The last miller lasted 312 before he got ground down." A splintering sound came from above. You glanced up to see the rafters crawling with shadows, their shapes indistinct but undeniably watching. The figure leaned in, the flour sack brushing your cheek. It smelled of old wheat and something far less pleasant. "The bargain's this. Swear yourself to the mill tonight, and you'll walk out that door come morning. Refuse." He let the silence stretch. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the sails creaking. The sound was unmistakably eager. You thought of the ledger's words. "Principal remains." Thought of the black dust in the visitors' sacks. Thought, most of all, of the way the tingling in your arm had begun to spread toward your chest. The sack-headed figure held out a hand. The skin was peeling, the nails blackened with old blood. "Do we have an understanding?" Somewhere deep in the mill, something chuckled. You reached for the offered hand. The moment your fingers touched, the vision struck, centuries flashing by in an instant, a parade of millers, each more hollow-eyed than the last, their hands feeding the stones, things that squirmed and bled and bayed. You saw Algernon, young and whole, signing his name in the ledger with a shaking hand. Saw the sack-headed figure as he'd once been, a proud craftsman, until the mill showed him what real craftsmanship meant. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving you gasping on the floor. The figure stood over you, head cocked. "Well..." Your voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I accept." The grindstone stopped. The shadows stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The sack-headed figure clapped his hands, a sound like bones knocking together. "Lovely, let's make it official then." He gestured to the ledger, where fresh ink now swirled into words. "'Tis night, in the year of our Lord redacted, I, your name here, do willingly and with full understanding pledge myself as keeper of the mill of everlasting sighs, to feed it as required, to honor its guests, and to remain in its service until such time as a suitable replacement is found." A pen appeared in your hand, its nib already dripping something too dark to be ink. You hesitated. The figure sighed. "Oh, don't look so grim. It's not all teeth and screaming. There are perks." "Perks?" "Absolutely. You'll never need to sharpen a blade again. And the rats." He leaned in conspiratorially. "The rats will adore you." Somehow that wasn't comforting. You signed. The moment the pen left the paper, the mill erupted in sound. Sails creaking, stones grinding, the very walls shuddering with what could only be described as applause. The sack-headed figure bowed deeply. "Congratulations," he said. "You're officially the most cursed man in hitherto unsmudged." Outside, the first of the midnight visitors arrived, their empty sacks already twitching with anticipation. The grinding, you realized, would never stop. But neither would you. Not until the next fool came along. Chapter 8. The Flower That Isn't. The first delivery arrived at dawn. A dozen burlap sacks left on the mill's doorstep, each stamped with Algernon's crest and an unsettling addendum, or the new keeper's use. The contents shifted slightly when you nudged one with your foot, as though filled with something that wasn't entirely asleep. You'd expected the mill's demands to involve teeth or blood or worse. But flour? That seemed almost benign. Until you opened the first sack. The substance inside wasn't white. It wasn't any color you could name, somewhere between the gray of old bruises and the shimmer of oil on water. When you scooped a handful, it clung to your fingers like wet ash before sliding away in slow, deliberate rivulets. It smelled faintly of almonds and something else, something that made the back of your throat tighten. The ledger had been clear. I first duty. Distribute the fruits of the mill. So you distributed. The baker took his sack with trembling hands, his face the color of curdled milk. Being years since we had to use the special stock, he muttered, hefting it onto his shoulder with the care of a man handling live ordnance. Suppose the village'll remember why soon enough. The widow Pembroke accepted hers with a knowing smirk, her ice-chip eyes glittering. Oh, this'll liven things up, she said, already measuring out a portion into a rusted tin. Do come by tomorrow. I'll have something interesting to show you. Even the children got their share, small packets tied with black ribbon, handed out by the schoolmaster with the solemnity of a priest distributing communion wafers. You kept one sack for yourself. Baking should have been simple. The recipe in Algernon's journal was straightforward. 3 measures flour, 1 egg, fresh pinch of salt, stolen tastes better. Mix until the dough size. The dough sighed all right. It also whimpered when needed. The finished loaf emerged from the oven looking perfectly normal. Golden brown crust, warm yeasty aroma. But the moment you set it on the counter, it twitched. Just once, a slight contraction near the middle, like a muscle flexing under skin. You told yourself it was the cooling process. Then the humming started. At first you thought it was the wind in the mill's sails. But no, the sound came from the loaf itself. A low, vibrational thrum that resonated in your molars. When you pressed a hand to the crust, you felt it pulse in slow, steady beats. You wrapped it in cloth and buried it at the bottom of the pantry. By morning, the wrappings had been shed, and the loaf sat proudly in the center of the shelf, its crust split in a way that looked uncomfortably like a grin. The village, meanwhile, had embraced the flour with disturbing enthusiasm. At the Drowned Rat, the innkeeper served pies that shimmered slightly when cut, their fillings moving with sluggish purpose. The baker's shop displayed rows of perfect rolls, each one breathing shallowly under their glass dome. The schoolchildren brought biscuits to class that wriggled in their lunch pails like caught fish. No one commented on these peculiarities. In fact, the villagers seemed almost cheerful as they went about their day, their eyes bright, their movements oddly synchronized. Only the widow Pembroke appeared unchanged, watching the proceedings with her usual dry amusement. "You look peaky," she observed when you stopped by her crooked house. "Not sleeping?" You gestured helplessly at the basket on her table. A lump of dough that was, unmistakably, flexing its edges like fingers stretching after a long nap. "Should I be?" She cackled, stirring a pot of something that bubbled a shade of purple not found in nature. "Oh, this is nothing. Wait until the bread starts singing." That night, the midnight visitors arrived early. They no longer wore tattered garments, their clothes now crisp and new, their movements fluid where before they'd been jerky. Their sacks bulged with offerings this time, jars of preserves that glowed faintly, bundles of herbs that curled toward your hands as you took them, a pie still warm from the oven that emitted a contented purr when set on the table. The leader, taller now, more solid, patted your cheek with a hand that felt almost human. "Good miller," it rasped. "Good flour." The ledger updated itself as they left. Consumption satisfactory. Next grinding. 2 full moons hence. Prepare the special hopper. You flipped back through older entries until you found Algernon's notes on the special hopper, a reinforced iron box that could be slotted into the grinding mechanism when needed. The last line of the entry sent a chill down your spine. Remember, the willing ones taste sweeter. Outside, the village slept the deep, untroubled sleep of those who've eaten well. In their kitchens, the leftover breads and cakes sat quietly in their wrappings, waiting for morning. And in the mill's darkest corner, the special hopper gleamed dully, its hinges freshly oiled. Chapter 9. The Missing Time. You went to bed on Tuesday night, after oiling the special hopper and reading Algernon's disturbing notes on harvest seasons. The last thing you remembered was blowing out the candle, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling in odd, spiraling patterns that almost looked like writing. When you opened your eyes, it was Saturday. 3 days gone, vanished like flour dust in the wind. Your hands told the story your memory couldn't. Stained black with soot up to the elbows, nails caked with something dark and flaky that smelled faintly of burnt hair. Your shirt was missing, replaced by one of Algernon's old work tunics, the fabric stiff with old sweat, and patches of some unidentifiable crust. But the real horror waited outside the window. The windmill's sails spun backward, not just slowly rotating, in reverse. They moved with violent, jerking motions, snapping counterclockwise, with enough force to make the whole structure shudder. Each rotation emitted a sound like a bone breaking, the wooden beams groaning under the unnatural strain. The village below looked different. The roofs of hitherto unsmudged gleamed oddly bright, as if freshly painted with something more luminous than ordinary pigment. The road leading into town had straightened, its once meandering path now ruler straight and paved with smooth, dark stones that seemed to swallow the morning light rather than reflect it. And the people, they moved differently. Not the eerie synchronicity of the flower-fed villagers, but something more deliberate, like marionettes with newly tightened strings. They went about their business with robotic precision, their faces blank, their steps perfectly measured. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages filled with handwriting that was almost yours, but not quite. The letters slanted sharper, the ink a shade too dark, as if something had written through you while you slept. Yea 1. Prepared the feast, fed the guests. They were particularly hungry this year. Yea 2. Distributed the ashes. The village accepted their portions without complaint, as always. K. Cleaned the hopper. The mill is satisfied, for now. At the bottom of the page, in different ink, I do not look for the missing days. They're happier where they are. The floor creaked behind you. The sack-headed figure stood in the doorway, his flour-dusted coveralls streaked with the same black soot that stained your hand. He held a wooden bucket filled with a thick, glistening substance that steamed slightly in the cool morning air. "Good. You're awake," he said, his voice oddly cheerful for a man who looked like death's understudy. "No time to waste. Need to get this last batch down before the village wakes up proper." You stared at the bucket. "What is that?" "Remnants," he said, as if that explained everything. "When you didn't move," he sighed and set the bucket down with a wet thud. "Look, you did fine for your first feast day, better than Algernon anyway." He wept for a week after. "But the work's not done until the ashes are spread." A memory surfaced, hazy, half-dreamed. Standing in the mill yard under a moon that burned black, handing out small wrapped parcels to villagers who lined up silently, their eyes reflecting no light. The parcels had squirmed in their hands. The sack-headed figure thrust the bucket toward you. "Take it to the crossroads, 1 handful at each compass point. Don't forget to say the words." "What words?" He tilted his head. the empty eye-holes of his sack somehow conveying exasperation. The ones you'll remember when the time comes. The substance in the bucket shifted as you took it, revealing a glimpse of something white and jagged before sinking back into the morass. It weighed more than it should have, the weight seeming to increase the longer you held it. Outside, the backward spinning sails let out a shriek like a wounded animal. The sack-headed figure didn't flinch. "Best hurry," he said. "The days won't stay missing forever." The path to the crossroads had changed. Where once a muddy track wound through scraggly brush, now a proper lane stretched, bordered by stones, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The village green had expanded, its edges too precise, the grass a shade too vibrant. At the center of the crossroads, the earth was bare, a perfect circle of packed dirt that looked recently turned. As you approached, the bucket grew heavier still, its contents sloshing with a sound like whispering voices. You dipped your hand in. The ashes were warm, and they clung, not like powder, but like wet clay, molding themselves to your fingers as you scooped them out. At each compass point, as you scattered them, the words came unbidden to your lips, a language you'd never learned, rolling off your tongue with practiced ease. The eastern portion hissed where it landed. The western patch sank into the earth like water into sand. The northern handful sprouted tiny white filaments that writhed for a moment before stilling. When you reached the southern point, the ashes in your palm moved on their own, forming a small, perfect mouth that whispered, "Thank you," before dissolving into the soil. By the time you returned to the mill, the sails had righted themselves, turning once more in their proper direction. The villagers were beginning to stir, their movements regaining some of their normal human awkwardness. The ledger had updated itself again. Next feast day, when the moon forgets her shape. Until then, keep grinding. The sack-headed figure was gone, but he'd left a gift on the table, a small iced cake with a single candle. The frosting spelled out, "Yea, happy unbirthday," in looping script. When you cut into it, the filling pulsed once before settling into a slow, steady rhythm. You ate every bite. The days might have been missing, but the hunger they left behind was very, very real. Chapter 10. The Hidden Chamber. The loose floorboard announced itself with a groan as you paced the mill's upper level, restless after the unsettling events of the missing days. At first you thought it was just another quirk of the aging structure, until you noticed the pattern in the wood grain where it didn't quite match its neighbors. Kneeling, you worked your fingers into the gap, feeling the board lift with surprising ease, as if it had been expecting you. Below lay a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the lantern light. A ladder descended into the gloom, its rungs worn smooth by generations of use. The air that wafted up was dry and oddly fragrant, like old parchment and crushed mint with an undercurrent of something metallic. You descended. The cellar stretched farther than the mill's footprint should have allowed, its walls lined with shelves upon shelves of burlap sacks, each neatly labeled with names and dates in fading ink. The first one you examined read Julius Candlewick, 1689, the town historian's namesake, perhaps. The sack was heavier than it looked, its contents shifting with a sound like dry sand as you hefted it. A quick tug at the drawstrings revealed a fine white powder that glimmered faintly in the lamplight. Bone meal. Not the ordinary sort used for gardens, but something purer, more intentional. When you let a handful trickle through your fingers, it fell in perfect arcs, as if resisting the pull of gravity for just a heartbeat too long. The dates on the sack spanned centuries. Some bore names you recognized from village lore. Pembroke, Thistlewick, even a few Wingraves. Others were strangers, their names archaic and forgotten. At the far end of the cellar, a newer shelf stood half empty, its labels freshly inked. The most recent sack was smaller than the others, its contents barely filling the bottom. The tag read Algernon P. Windgrave, current year with an addendum. Partial payment. A workbench occupied the center of the chamber, its surface stained with dark rings and scattered with tools that ranged from ordinary mortars and pestles to implements of more obscure purpose. A set of silver tongs shaped like bird claws, a glass funnel etched with spiraling runes, and a knife with a blade so thin it seemed to vibrate at the edges of vision. A ledger lay open on the bench, its pages filled with Algernon's cramped handwriting. Unlike the upstairs volume, this one contained no records of grindings or tributes. Instead, it read like a recipe book. For longevity. 1 part ancestor ash, 2 parts midnight flower, ground under a waning moon. Mix with honey stolen from a hive that knows your name. Consume before the cock crows. Ga for forgetting. The dust of one's own left molar, blended with poppy tears and the breath of a sleeping child. Burn at crossroads. Let the smoke enter through the eyes. The final entry was fresher, the ink barely dry. For escape. All previous methods proven faulty. The mill claims what it is owed. But perhaps, if one were to leave behind enough of oneself, a remnant might slip free. See, partial payment above. A sound from above made you start. A creak of footsteps crossing the mill floor. Too heavy to be the sack-headed figure, too deliberate to be one of the midnight visitors. The ledger snapped shut on its own as the footsteps paused directly overhead. A voice called down, familiar and unsettlingly cheerful. "Miller? You down there?" It was the baker. And he sounded hungry. You eased the floorboard back into place just as the first flecks of flour began to drift down from above, sparkling in the lamplight like snow in reverse. The cellar, for all its macabre contents, suddenly felt safer than the world above. But the ladder trembled under a new weight. Someone was coming down. The nearest sack, the one labeled with your own surname, though you had no memory of placing it there, rustled invitingly. Somewhere in the darkness, something chuckled. You reached for the sack. The footsteps descended. The cellar held its breath. Chapter 11. The Miller's True Fate. The baker's footsteps halted mid-descent. A terrible silence filled the cellar, thick enough to choke on. The sack bearing your surname lay heavy in your hands, its contents shifting with an almost eager rustle. Then, from above, a wet crunching sound, like a melon dropped from a great height, followed by the baker's voice, now warped and bubbling as if spoken through a mouthful of molasses. You can't hide from the grist, Miller. Something heavy slumped against the ladder, sending a shower of dust cascading from the ceiling. The cellar door slammed shut with finality, plunging you into near darkness save for the guttering lantern light. Algernon's ledger on the workbench flipped open of its own accord, its pages rifling backward to an entry near the beginning. The handwriting here was frantic, the ink blotted in places where the quill had pressed too hard. October 12th. I will not become another sack in the cellar. I have seen them, the previous millers. Their remains sit on those shelves, grinning at me through the burlap. The mill claims it's an honor, that to be ground is to become part of something eternal. Lies. The mill is hungry, and it... The pages turned, revealing increasingly desperate entries. Gunnard attempted the finish method today, substituted rowan ash for the usual tribute. The stones screamed for hours afterward. The visitors left unsatisfied. My left molar aches where I pried it loose to pay the difference. December 24th. Tried to flee at midnight. Reached the county line before realizing I was walking in circles. Dawn found me back at the mill, my boots filled with black flour. The sack-headed spectre laughed as he brushed the dust from my shoulders. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the letters slanting wildly as if scrawled in a moving wagon. January 1st. The mill has accepted my proposal. Partial payment given, the fingers first as they're least required for grinding. The pain is extraordinary, but the freedom should be worth it. If this works, I will be gone before the moon rises. If not, well, at least my sack will be a small one. Beneath this indifferent ink and a far steadier hand, someone had added, "It did not work." The ledger snapped shut as a new sound filled the cellar, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like a butcher's knife being sharpened. From the shelves around you, the sacks began to tremble, their contents shifting restlessly. The one in your hands grew warm, then hot, until you were forced to drop it. It hit the floor with a puff of white powder that hung in the air, forming a shape roughly the size and proportion of a man. The flower figure reached for you with insubstantial hands. Above, the cellar door creaked open. The sack-headed figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, his usual flour sack replaced by one made of finer cloth. Silk, perhaps, or something closer to skin. His voice, when he spoke, was almost gentle. Every miller tries to run. Every miller fails. The ones who struggle least get the lightest sacks. The flower shape dissipated as he stepped aside, revealing the ladder once more. The baker was gone, but his hat lay on the floor above, neatly folded and dusted with fresh white powder. "Come," said the sack-headed figure. "The stones are waiting, and they do so hate to be kept waiting." The climb back to the mill proper felt like ascending through layers of a nightmare. The grindstones were already in motion, their surfaces gleaming with a strange, oily sheen. The special hopper sat installed, its iron maw gaping. The sack-headed figure gestured to it with a flourish. "You've read the alternatives. This is cleaner than most." A cold certainty settled over you. Algernon's fate, the cellar full of predecessors, the villagers' eerie compliance. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. The mill didn't just need a miller. It needed material. Why did it? They didn't kill it, see aside. From mine. From your pocket, the black dust you'd collected weeks before gave a sympathetic pulse. It knew what came next. The sack-headed figure held out a velvet bag. "For the teeth," he explained. "They grind best when given freely." Outside, the wind picked up, setting the sails spinning with joyous abandon. Somewhere in the village a child laughed, a sound too bright and clear for hitherto unsmudged. You reached for the bag. The stones sang as they prepared to meet their newest collaborator. Chapter 12. The Village's Complicity. The velvet bag weighed nothing in your hand, yet it dragged at your arm like an anchor. The sack-headed figure waited patiently by the grinding stones, his flour sack face unreadable, but his posture radiating a terrible anticipation. Outside, the village sounds had taken on a festive quality. Laughter where there should have been silence, music where there should have been wind. You hesitated, the bag dangling from your fingers. "How many?" you asked. The sack-headed figure tilted his head. "How many what? How many millers have there been?" He laughed then, a sound like wheat stalks rubbing together in a dry field. "Oh, more than the cellar shows. The sacks only keep the best ones, the rest." He gestured to the mill's walls, its beams dark with age and something else, something that seeped into the wood grain like a stain. A metallic taste filled your mouth. You thought of Algernon's final entry, partial payment, and the too small sack with his name. Thought of the villagers' strange contentment, their willingness to bake with whatever the mill produced. Thought most of all of the lawyer's smirk when he'd handed you the deed. "Why me?" The sack-headed figure shrugged, a disturbingly human gesture. "Why not you? The village provides, the mill consumes. It's an old arrangement." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale flour and something sweetly rotten. "They've been sending outsiders here for generations. The drunkards, the debtors, the ones who ask too many questions. The solicitor finds them, the will names them, and the mill..." He patted the nearest grinding stone affectionately. "The mill makes them useful." From somewhere below, a faint rustling echoed through the floorboards, the cellar sacks shifting on their shelves. He dropped the velvet bag. It hit the floor with a muffled clink, spilling a handful of yellowed teeth across the wood. They looked old, worn smooth by time and use. None of them were yours. Yet, the sack-headed figure sighed. They always struggle at this part. He reached into his apron pocket and withdrew a small silver bell, its surface tarnished black in intricate patterns that hurt to look at for too long. Shall I call the elders? They do so love to watch. You took a step back, then another. The mill door stood open, the afternoon light streaming in like an invitation. Or a taunt. The sack-headed figure didn't move to stop you. He simply rang the bell, a clear, high note that seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have. By the time you reached the village square, they were already gathering. The baker with his flour-dusted apron, the widow Pembroke with her too-sharp smile, the schoolmaster herding children who giggled behind their hands, even Elias Candlewick, swaying slightly from drink, but watching with sober intensity. They formed a loose circle around you, their expressions a mix of pity and relief. The widow spoke first. We did try to warn you, dear. All those hints about leaving, about burning the place down. But you had to go poking in the cellar, didn't you? The baker nodded, kneading his hands together in a motion that sent puffs of white powder into the air. It's better this way. The mill needs feeding, and we need our bread. Outsiders come and go, but the village remains. A child piped up from the crowd, her voice bright and clear. My great-grandfather was a miller. Mama says he makes the best flour now. The sack-headed figure appeared at the edge of the square, his bell silent now. In his other hand, he held the velvet bag, now full to bursting. The circle tightened. The widow Pembroke stepped forward, her gnarled hands outstretched, in what might have been a gesture of comfort. Don't fight it, boy, Algernon fought, and look what good it did him. Half of him's in the special hopper, the other half in his morning biscuits. The silver bell rang again, though no one had touched it. The villagers sighed in unison, their breath stirring the dust at their feet. You ran. They let you. The road out of hitherto unsmudged stretched ahead, straight and smooth as it had become during the missing days. Your footsteps kicked up little clouds of the dark paving stone's dust, each puff hanging in the air just a moment too long before settling back to the ground. Behind you, no one gave chase. The mill's sails turned lazily in a non-existent wind. The villagers returned to their homes. And in the cellar beneath the mill, a new sack began to form on the shelves, its label blank but waiting. The stones, after all, could be patient when they needed to be. Chapter 13. The escape plan. You made it 3 miles down the impossibly straight road before the whispers started. At first they blended with the rustle of leaves, easy enough to dismiss as wind through the hedgerows. But by the 4th mile, they'd coalesced into words, murmuring just below the threshold of hearing. Burn it, and the hunger spreads. The road dust seemed to sigh beneath your feet. Ashes fly farther than flour. The widow Pembroke's crooked house appeared ahead, though the geometry was all wrong. You hadn't doubled back, yet here it perched beside the road where no dwelling had stood before. The old woman herself rocked on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl that wriggled with something more than legumes. She didn't look up as you approached. Come to steal my lamp oil, have you? Her voice cracked like dry kindling. That's always the first thought. Algernon tried it in 32. Set the thatch ablaze and nearly danced with joy, until the flames turned black and started licking back toward his fingers. She held up a withered hand. The fingers fused together into a single fleshy paddle. The mill doesn't burn, boy, but millers do. You stared at the ruined hand. The skin bore a peculiar pattern, not scars, but letters, tiny and precise, spelling something in a language that hurt to read. The whispers intensified, now coming from the pea pods themselves as they split beneath the widow's thumbs. Each spark becomes a mouth, they chorused. Each ember, and I would dis The widow tossed a handful of peas into her garden, where the earth swallowed them with a wet, satisfied sound. Fool's errand, arson. Better to cheat it proper. She fixed you with those ice-chip eyes. You've seen the cellar. You know what's required. A cold realization crept over you. The partial payments. The sacks with dates but no names. Algernon's final, desperate attempt. You want me to feed it part of myself. The widow cackled, her laughter sending a flock of starlings bursting from her chimney in a panic. Oh, it's not about want, dearie. It's about what's owed. She leaned forward, her rocking chair groaning like the mill's sails. The mill will have its due. The question is, will you pay in pieces now or all at once later? Inside the house something heavy thudded against the walls, sending cracks racing through the plaster. The widow didn't flinch. "Tick-tock," she murmured. "The stones are grinding whether you feed them or not." You left her there, still rocking, still shelling, as the road curved unnaturally back toward hitherto unsmudged. The whispers followed, now taking up residence in your own shadow, which stretched long and thin ahead of you regardless of the sun's position. "Fingers first," your shadow suggested in a voice suspiciously like your own. "You've got 10 to spare." By the time you reached the abandoned churchyard at the edge of town, the plan had taken shape. Not fire. That was too blunt, too predictable. No, you'd starve the mill instead. Let the hunger turn inward. The grave markers here listed no names, only dates that corresponded neatly with the cellar's collection. You selected the freshest stone and dug with your bare hands, the earth yielding suspiciously easily. The box was small, barely larger than a bread loaf, its wood unmarked and unvarnished. Inside lay a single molar wrapped in yellowed parchment. The note read simply, "First payment." Never enough. Your shadow pooled around the open grave, whispering faster now. "Taket it. Trade it. You'll never miss one tooth." The church bell tolled once, though the tower had lain in ruins for a century. From the mill's distant silhouette, a thin black smoke began to rise. Not from burning timber, but from the grindstones themselves, their surfaces overheating with nothing left to grind. You held the tooth in your palm, feeling the faintest pulse within its enamel. The whispers grew deafening. Somewhere in the village, a baby began to cry. A dog howled. The widow Pembroke's peas continued their ceaseless, chattering peal. And beneath it all, barely audible, came the sound of the mill's great stones, grinding, nothing but air, and liking it. The tooth grew warm in your hand. The whispers held their breath. You made your choice. Chapter 14. The Final Night. The tooth burned a hole in your pocket all the way back to the mill. Not a physical heat, something worse. A persistent nagging presence like a splinter working its way deeper. The mill loomed ahead, its sails now spinning wildly, despite the dead calm air. Black smoke coiling from the grinding mechanism, like venom from a serpent's fangs. The visitors were already there. Not just the tattered figures from before, but dozens of them, some barely more than wisps of shadow, others nearly solid. They stood in concentric circles around the mill, their empty sacks dangling limp at their sides. None moved as you approached, but their heads turned in perfect unison, hollow eyes fixing on your pocket where the tooth lay hidden. The whispering started again, this time from all directions at once. "Care brings payment. Too small. Bravest of many." The sack-headed figure emerged from the mill's doorway, his usual flour sack replaced by one that glistened unpleasantly in the moonlight. He spread his arms in greeting. "Miller returns, and not empty-handed, I see." His head tilted toward your pocket. "Though I wonder, did you dig that up, or pry it fresh?" You said nothing. The tooth seemed to pulse against your thigh. Inside, the mill was a cacophony of sound, the grindstones shrieking as they spun without touching, the wooden beams groaning like dying men, the ledger's pages flapping madly as if caught in a gale. The cellar door stood open, the darkness below breathing dust into the air with slow, deliberate exhalations. The sack-headed figure gestured to the grinding stones. "They'll take what you offer, but mind, partial payments require interest." You withdrew the tooth. In the flickering lantern light, you could now see the marks carved into its surface, tiny runes spiraling down toward the root. It vibrated in your palm, humming a single discordant note that made your jaw ache in sympathy. The visitors pressed closer, their empty sacks twitching. A memory surfaced, Algernon's ledger entry about the finish method, the screaming stones, the widow's ruined hand, the way the villagers had let you run, but never truly chased. You closed your fist around the tooth. The sack-headed figure sighed. "Ah, that kind of night, is it?" The first visitor lunged. You sidestepped, flinging the tooth not toward the stones, but into the open cellar. It struck the ladder with a sharp clinking before tumbling into the darkness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the screaming started. Not human screams. Something far older, far hungrier. The cellar's darkness boiled upward, disgorging clouds of flour that swirled into grasping hands and gaping mouths. The visitors recoiled, their empty sacks flapping like panicked birds. The grindstones let out a sound like 1,000 bones snapping, and lurched to a stop. The sack-headed figure staggered back as the mill's very walls began to tremble. "What have you done?" he rasped, his voice fraying at the edges. You backed toward the door as the first of the cellar sacks came floating up the ladder, its burlap splitting to release a storm of bone-white powder that hung in the air, forming shapes, faces, limbs, screaming mouths. The visitors scattered, some dissolving into mist, others clawing at their own sacks as if to empty them faster. Outside, the village lights blinked out one by one. The mill's sails wrenched backward with a sound like a spine being twisted from its socket. The sack-headed figure made one last grab for you, his fingers brushing your sleeve as he hissed, "It'll come for you now. The hunger always finds its millers." You ran. Behind you, the mill imploded with a sound like a dying breath, its timbers collapsing inward as the cellar's contents raged upward in a cyclone of screaming dust. The last thing you saw before the road curved away was the sack-headed figure being pulled into the maelstrom. His final, furious shriek cut short as the mill consumed its keeper whole. The whispers in your shadow fell silent. The tooth's weight vanished from your pocket. And far away, in a village that no longer appeared on any maps, the first true wind in centuries stirred the ashes of the mill of everlasting sighs, carrying with it the faint, fading taste of almonds and regret. Chapter 15. The Twist of Irony. The morning after the mill's destruction found you sitting on a stump at the edge of what had once been hitherto unsmudged, chewing absently on a piece of perfectly normal bread from a nearby village. The stump, you realized with a start, was the only remnant of the crooked house signpost that had once pointed the way to the widow Pembroke's home. A traveling tinker passing by paused to study you with mild curiosity. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," he remarked, his wagon creaking with the weight of mundane pots and pans. You nearly laughed. "Just a bad inheritance." The tinker nodded sagely. "Ah, Windmill, was it?" At your startled look, he shrugged. "There's a story in these parts about cursed mills and clever lawyers. They say the trick is to refuse the deed before sundown on the third day." He scratched his nose thoughtfully. "Or maybe it's to accept the deed but never grind anything. Or perhaps to grind only on Tuesdays. The stories change with each telling." You stared at the space where the mill had stood, now just an oddly circular patch of bare earth. What if you never wanted it in the first place? The tinker's smile revealed several missing teeth. "Then congratulations. You've just won a very old game." He rummaged in his wagon and produced a small, flour-dusted bottle. "Here, from the last batch. Consider it your prize." The label read Woundgrave's finest, aged in the mill of everlasting size in elaborate script. Inside swirled a liquid the color of storm clouds. You uncorked it. The scent that wafted out was unmistakably that of the mill's strange flour, almonds and something unplaceable, but with an alcoholic burn that made your eyes water. The first sip tasted like regret. The second, like relief. By the third sip you could almost hear the faint, fading echo of the grindstone spinning backward one last time. The tinker watched with amusement. "They never think to ask why the mill needed so many keepers," he said. "All those clever men trying to cheat the curse, to profit from the grinding. The mill didn't hunger for flesh, it hungered for greed." He took the bottle back and stoppered it carefully. "But you just wanted to be rid of the damn thing." A breeze stirred the ashes at your feet, revealing a single, unburned scrap of paper. The corner of a deed, the ink still legible. "Shall inherit the mill of everlasting size, its contents, and all attendant responsibilities, to be held in perpetuity, unless—" The rest had burned away. The tinker's wagon creaked as he climbed aboard. "If you're ever in the market for property," he called over his shoulder, "I hear there's a lovely abandoned lighthouse up north. Terrible history, of course. But I'm sure that wouldn't bother you." His laughter faded with the distance, leaving you alone with the ashes and the dregs of the bottle. Somewhere beneath your feet, buried under centuries of bad decisions, the mill's foundation stones waited. Perhaps they'd remain quiet. Perhaps they'd whisper to the next fool who came digging. You tipped the last of the liquor onto the barren ground, watching as it soaked into the earth without ceremony. From deep below came a sound like a contented sigh. Then silence. The road ahead was just a road. The sky above held nothing but clouds. And in the ruins of hitherto unsmudge, the rats began to return. Ordinary, unremarkable rats, with no taste for cursed flour and no interest in dead millers. You took one last look at the place where the mill had stood, then turned your back on it without ceremony. Some curses, it seemed, only bound those arrogant enough to think they could outgrind them. Chapter 16. The Unlikely Salvation. The road out of hitherto unsmudge had never felt longer. Your legs ached from running. Your lungs burned from the strange flour-choked air still clinging to the ruins of the mill, and your pockets, once weighed down by the cursed tooth and black dust, were now unsettlingly light. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and sickly yellow. And the whispers of the mill, though distant now, still hissed at the edges of your hearing. "She'll be back," they murmured, not in malice, but in certainty. "He'll always come back." You almost believed them, until the sound of jingling harnesses and boisterous laughter cut through the gloom. Rounding a bend in the road, you nearly collided with the most absurd sight imaginable. A procession of men and women clad in ill-fitting medieval garb, their tunics a riot of historically inaccurate colors, their helmets and hoods looking like they'd been pilfered from a costume shop's clearance bin. At the head of the group rode a man on a shaggy pony, waving a foam-padded sword with tremendous enthusiasm. "Ho, traveler!" he bellowed, his accent thick with modern inflection. "You look like you've seen the Black Death itself. Pray, what horror has befallen thee on this fair eve?" Before you could formulate a response, or so much as blink, the spectral millers emerged from the trees. The sack-headed figure led them, his flour-dusted shroud now torn and frayed, his hollow eyes burning with a hunger that had nothing to do with bread. The others followed, their tattered garments whispering against the ground, their empty sacks dragging behind them like funeral shrouds. They moved with purpose, their attention fixed solely on you, until the reactors spotted them. A woman in a garishly embroidered kirtle gasped in delight. "Oh, look at these marvelous actors!" She clapped her hands, utterly unfazed by the unnatural pallor of their skin, or the way their feet didn't quite touch the ground. "The makeup is incredible. Are you part of the festival? The spectral millers froze. The sack-headed figure's head tilted, as if trying to comprehend the sheer audacity of being mistaken for a living, breathing performer. One of the other ghosts let out a low, confused groan, his fingers twitching toward his empty sack before hesitating. The reenactor leader seized the moment. By God, these lads are committed. He swung down from his pony and slapped the sack-headed figure on the back, his hand passing cut through the specter's shoulder with a faint puff of flour. If he noticed, he didn't let on. Tell me, good sir, what troupe do you hail from? This is exactly the kind of immersive theater we strive for in the jolly old historical reenactment and ale-tasting society. The ghosts exchanged glances. The whispers in the trees stuttered into silence. One of the spectral millers, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and fingers like splintered bone, opened his mouth as if to speak. The reenactor leader interrupted with a dramatic flourish. No, don't tell me. You're doing the E-Miller's ghost folk tale, aren't you? Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. He turned to his companions. Everyone, observe the authenticity. The way their clothes are distressed. The Yule-haunting gauntness of their faces. This, my friends, is Gar. The ghosts looked at each other again. The sack-headed figure's shoulders slumped in what might have been resignation. The woman in the kirtle pulled out her phone. Do you mind if we get a picture? This is Eggy So going on the Society's Instagram. That was your cue. While the spectral miller stood in baffled silence, surrounded by overly enthusiastic history buffs, snapping selfies and debating whether their costumes were late medieval or early Renaissance, you slipped past the group and kept walking. The road stretched ahead, blessedly empty. The whispers had stopped. The weight in your pocket stayed gone. Behind you, the reenactors' voices faded into the distance, their laughter punctuated by the occasional confused moan from a ghost who had, for the first time in centuries, been rendered utterly speechless. You didn't look back. Some curses, it seemed, could be broken not by grand gestures or ancient rituals, but by the sheer oblivious power of people who didn't believe in them. And as the last light of day vanished, you allowed yourself a small, weary smile. The mill was gone. The ghosts were distracted. And you? You were never accepting another inheritance again. Chapter 17. The Aftermath. Months passed. The seasons turned. You told yourself you'd left the mill behind. Its curses, its ghosts, its impossible hunger. You settled in a city where no one had heard of hitherto unsmudge, where flour came in sterile paper bags, and where windmills existed only as decorative motifs on overpriced coffee cups. Then the dreams began. Not nightmares, just dreams of walking through an empty mill, your fingers trailing over silent grindstones, the air thick with the scent of almonds and something metallic. Sometimes you'd wake with dust on your sheets, fine and white as fresh ground flour. Sometimes your hands ached as if you'd been kneading dough all night. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just your name written in a shaky hand you almost recognized. Inside was a single slip of paper. Your stones still turn. They miss you. You burned it. The flames hissed as they consumed the paper, spitting out sparks that danced in the shape of tiny, spinning sails before vanishing. The second letter came with a handful of teeth rattling loose inside the envelope. Molars, by the look of them. Fresh. You didn't burn this one. You took it to a jeweler, someone accustomed to odd requests, and asked if the gold fillings could be salvaged. The third letter found you at a cafe, slipped under your coffee cup by a waiter who swore he hadn't seen anyone leave it. This one contained a photograph. The ruins of the mill, its foundation stones blackened but intact. In the center of the frame stood a familiar figure, the sack-headed miller, his flour sack hood now mottled with soot stains. Written on the back, you caretaker needed. Inquire within. That night you drank. Not the strange mill-aged liquor from the tinker, but something cheap and modern, the kind of whiskey that burned away memories instead of preserving them. It didn't help. The dreams came anyway. This time, you stood in the cellar. The shelves groaned under the weight of new sacks, some large, some small, all neatly labeled. Your fingers brushed one bearing a name you didn't recognize, then another, and another, until... there. A sack no bigger than a fist. The tag read only, "Partial payment." You woke with a start, your mouth dry, your hands clenched around something that wasn't there. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Outside your window, the wind carried a sound that might have been laughter, or grinding stones. Morning brought a visitor, not a ghost, not a letter, but the widow Pembroke herself, standing on your doorstep in a moth-eaten shawl, her ice chip eyes gleaming with amusement. "You look terrible," she observed, pushing past you into the apartment. "City life doesn't suit you." You stared. "How did you find me?" She waved a gnarled hand. The mill whispers. Not words exactly, more like cravings. She settled onto your couch, her bones creaking louder than the springs. "They want you back, of course. Not all of you, just enough to keep the stones turning." You poured 2 glasses of water. She turned hers into something murky, with a splash from a flask she produced from her skirts. "They say the mill's gone," you ventured. She snorted. "Gone? Oh, the building burned, sure. But the stones, the hunger." She took a sip, smacking her lips. "Those are older than mortar, older than names. They'll outlast us all." The silence stretched. Outside, a siren wailed, a modern sound, a living sound. The widow set her glass down with a click. "You've got choices, boy. Not good ones, mind. But choices all the same." She left a folded slip of paper on the table. You waited until the door shut behind her before opening it. A train ticket. Destination, hitherto unsmudged. On the back, in the widow's spidery hand, midnight grinding. "Bring your own teeth." You burned this one too. The flames turned black as they consumed it, and for a moment you could swear you heard the faintest sigh of satisfaction. That night, the dreams changed. This time, you stood at the grindstones. They turned at your touch, smooth and silent. The flour they produced was pure white, innocent as snow. The sack-headed figure watched from the shadows, his hood now stitched with golden thread that glinted in the moonlight. "Keeper or kept," he murmured. "Gay choice was always yours." You woke with flour on your hands. Outside, the wind carried the scent of burning almonds. Somewhere far away, in a village that no longer existed, the stones turned. And in the darkness between heartbeats, they whispered your name. Chapter 18. The New Heir. The train to hitherto unsmudged no longer appeared on any public schedule, yet the ticket the widow Pembroke had left behind proved valid. The conductor who punched it had yellowed fingernails and a knowing glint in his eye as he muttered, "Return trips never guaranteed." The other passengers, few as they were, kept their heads down, their collars turned up against a chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the carriage. You told yourself you were only going back to confirm the mill was truly gone, to silence the dreams, to prove to yourself that the whispers were just your imagination. The village, when you arrived, was both familiar and wrong. The pub sign now read, "Kai the Drowned Miller," instead of "Fi the Drowned Ratai." The post office had been rebuilt, its bricks blackened as if by recent fire, and the path to the mill, once overgrown and half forgotten, was now a proper lane, its edges lined with white stones that gleamed like teeth in the afternoon sun. You saw the lawyer before he saw you. Mr. Thistlewick stood outside the rebuilt post office, his ivory complexion gone sallow, his sharp smile dulled at the edges like a well-used blade. He was speaking to a young man in a too-new coat, their heads bent close together. Even from a distance you recognized the posture, The slight confusion, the dawning interest, the moment when greed overcame sense. Then came the deed. The same thick parchment, the same wax seal, the same crest that had once burned itself into your memory. Tislowick pressed it into the young man's hands with a chuckle, his lips moving in words you couldn't hear, but didn't need to. Congratulations on your inheritance. Kindness. Your feet moved before your mind could protest. The lawyer looked up as you approached, his smirk widening in recognition. Ah, our former miller returns, come to offer guidance to your successor. The young man, barely more than a boy, really, turned wide eyes toward you. You're the one who burned it down? Tislowick finished for him, chuckling. Oh yes, we've had quite the exciting year thanks to this one. He clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder. But not to worry. The mill has a way of rebuilding itself when properly motivated. The deed in the boy's hand seemed to pulse, its edges curling like living things seeking purchase. You remembered that weight, that terrible promise. You don't have to take it, you said, the words tasting like ash. The boy blinked. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face, too wide, too knowing. Oh, but I think I do. His fingers tightened on the parchment. Great-uncle Algernon always said I'd inherit something special. The name struck like a hammer. Tislowick's laugh was the sound of dry bones rattling. The wheel of the mill turns, my dear former client, grinds exceedingly fine and all that. He leaned in, his breath reeking of old paper and spoiled ink. Speaking of, have you come to settle your remaining dues? The boy, Algernon's kin, was already walking toward the mill path. The deed clutched tight, his steps light with anticipation. The lawyer lingered just long enough to whisper, "They always come back, one way or another." Then he was gone, vanishing into the post office with a final mocking bow. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest scent of almonds, and the barest whisper of grindstones turning in the distance. You stood there, caught between warning the boy and walking away, between breaking the cycle and letting it claim its newest fool. The choice, as always, was yours. But as the first flakes of blackened flour began to drift from the mill path, you realized with dawning horror that you'd been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't about whether the mill could be destroyed. It was about whether you could let someone else take your place. Chapter 19. The moral. The truth about cursed inheritances is this. They're never really about the ghosts or the grindstones or the mysterious black flour that may or may not contain the powdered remains of your predecessors. No, the real evil lies in the legal system that allows these abominations to persist across generations. Passed down like some grotesque family heirloom, along with the good silver and that one ugly painting of Uncle Mortimer. No one has the heart to burn. Consider the paperwork alone. The deed to the mill of everlasting size contained no fewer than 17 subclauses regarding attendant responsibilities and perpetual covenants, all written in the kind of looping legalese designed to make your eyes glaze over before reaching the important bit. Usually something along the lines of the undersigned agrees to forfeit their soul. And all this, mind you, under the cheerful heading beneficiary rights and privileges. And I see, Algernon had tried to fight it in court, of course. His diary contained several increasingly desperate entries about filing motions to contest the will, only to be told by every solicitor from here to London that testamentary freedom gave dear departed great-aunt Euphemia the right to bequeath her murderous mill to whomever she pleased. The law, it seemed, cared not one whit whether the property in question happened to hunger for human teeth. Even your brief ownership followed this proud tradition. The moment Tislowick's oily fingers pressed that deed into your palm, you became liable for centuries of accrued metaphysical debts, all thanks to the doctrine of universal successor and a particularly spiteful bit of common law regarding chattels demonic. The villagers, naturally, had their own legal fiction. The quaint notion that so long as the mill had a designated miller, the rest of them bore no culpability. This despite the fact that their ancestors had deliberately built the thing atop an ancient execution site, and their grandparents had cheerfully baked with flour they knew contained at least 30% human remains. But no, let the outsider take the fall. After all, he'd signed the papers. Watching young Algernon's descendant march toward his doom, you found yourself pondering the sheer bureaucratic genius of it all. The mill didn't need to trap its victims with magic when probate law did the job so much more efficiently. Why bother with hauntings when a properly notarized covenant could bind a man tighter than any ghostly chain? The widow Pembroke found you still standing there when the first flakes of blackened flour began to drift from the mill path. She smelled of lavender and something sharper, like old blood and lemon zest. "They never read the fine print," she said, nodding toward the distant figure of the new heir. "Funny, isn't it? A man will scrutinize a tavern bill for overcharges, but hand him a contract that includes his eventual dismemberment, and he'll sign with a flourish. You thought of the deed in your own pocket, the one you'd never truly gotten rid of, merely misplaced for a time. The parchment had reappeared last week, tucked between the pages of a cookbook you didn't remember buying. Its wax seal remained unbroken, but the words "a perpetuating" and "a binding" seemed to have grown larger, bolder, as if to compensate for your inattention. The widow followed your gaze and chuckled. "Oh yes, that's the other dirty secret. You can quit being the miller, but the mill never quits being yours." She patted your arm with her ruined hand, the fused fingers leaving a faint dusting of white powder on your sleeve. "Still, look on the bright side. There's a bright side? Of course." Her smile showed teeth too even, too white, to be entirely human. "Now you get to be the one smirking when the next fool signs away his molars." In the distance, the grindstones began to turn. The wind carried the sound toward town, where already you could see the baker preparing his ovens, the schoolmaster herding his students inside, the lawyer no doubt drafting another set of airtight documents. The wheel turned. The law held firm, and somewhere in the mill's newly rebuilt depths, a fresh sack of flour began to whisper. You turned your back on it all and walked away. After all, you'd read the fine print, and nowhere did it say you had to watch. Chapter 20. The Bonus Nightmare. The apartment smelled of freshly baked bread when you returned. This should have been impossible. You hadn't baked in months, hadn't even owned flour since the incident with the whispering dough. Yet the scent hung thick in the air, warm and yeasty with that faint undercurrent of almonds that made your teeth ache. You found the source in the kitchen. A single biscuit sat centered on the counter, perfectly golden, still steaming slightly as if just pulled from the oven. No plate, no note. Just a biscuit, radiating a quiet, patient menace. You stared at it. It did not stare back, being a biscuit, but you felt observed nonetheless. The sensible thing would have been to throw it out. The sane thing would have been to burn the building down. Instead, you poked it with a fork. The biscuit sighed. Not a metaphorical sigh. Not the imagined exhalation of settling crumbs. A real human sigh, the kind usually reserved for people who have just discovered their flight has been delayed another 3 hours. You dropped the fork. The biscuit shuddered. Then, with the slow inevitability of a rising tide, it split cleanly down the middle. Inside, nestled in a pocket of still warm dough, lay a single molar. Your molar, to be precise, if the dental records from your ill-advised escape attempt were any indication. The one you'd left behind. The one that should have been ground to dust months ago. It gleamed wetly in the kitchen light, its surface etched with tiny, spiraling symbols that hadn't been there before. The biscuit's halves quivered. From somewhere deep in the apartment, maybe the hall closet, maybe the space behind the refrigerator, came the faintest sound of grindstones turning. You reached for the trash can. The biscuit lunged first. Not like a predator, not like some feral pastry gone mad. No, It moved with purpose, with precision, hopping off the counter and landing squarely in the open drawer where you kept the takeout menus. By the time you processed this, it had already wedged itself behind the stack of pizza leaflets, leaving only a trail of crumbs to mark its passage. The drawer slid shut on its own. Silence fell. Slowly, carefully, you backed out of the kitchen. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows clinging to the walls with unusual tenacity. Your hand found the light switch. The bulb exploded in a shower of glass and blackened flour. Darkness pooled around you, thick and granular. From the kitchen came a new sound, the crisp snap of a biscuit breaking in half, followed by the unmistakable pop of a soda can opening. You closed your eyes. When you opened them again, the apartment was as you'd left it. No biscuit, no molar, no sentient baked goods plotting in the drawers. Just an ordinary kitchen in an ordinary apartment. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator. You almost believed it. Then you noticed the dust. A fine black powder coated the counter where the biscuit had been, already forming tiny dunes in the crevices. As you watched, a single grain rolled downhill to join its fellows, leaving behind a trail that looked suspiciously like an arrow pointing toward the bedroom. The bedroom where you'd hidden the deed. The bedroom where, even now, something rustled under the bed. Something dry, something patient, something that smelled of old wheat and older hunger. You sighed. The apartment sighed with you. Somewhere, a millstone turned. And in the darkness, something that was not quite flour began to rise.